Thousands of years ago, in the heart of the desert, an astonishing word was spoken. After a battle between Israel and an enemy people called Amalek, a solemn declaration was proclaimed. It is found in the book of Exodus and reads, "Because a hand was lifted up against the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." This short but powerful sentence raises many questions. What does it truly mean to lift up a hand against the throne of the Lord? Why was this war to continue from generation to generation? And most importantly, does this word belong only to the past, or can we still see its traces in history and current world events? In this video, we will explore the context of this declaration, trace its fulfillment in the biblical history of the people of Israel, and consider how some still interpret this prophecy today in light of contemporary events. This statement, "Because a hand was lifted up against the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation," is found in the biblical book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 17 verse 16. To understand this passage, it is necessary to place this event in its historical context. At that time, the people of Israel had just emerged from slavery in Egypt under the leadership of Moses. After several centuries of servitude, the Israelites found themselves in the desert, on their way to the land God had promised them. They were still a vulnerable people, in transition, without a true military organization, entirely dependent on God for their protection and sustenance. Shortly before, they had already witnessed several miraculous interventions by God, including the crossing of the Red Sea and the provision of water in the desert at Rephidim. It was precisely during this period of vulnerability that a people called Amalek attacked Israel. The Amalekites were nomadic tribes, living in the desert regions south of Canaan. They were known for their swift raids against caravans, or groups on the move. According to the biblical account, their attack was not honorable. They attacked Israel from the rear, specifically targeting the weakest, the weary, and those lagging behind the rest of the people. This detail is later recounted in the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 17 to 18. This tactic gives their attack a particular moral dimension, as they exploited the vulnerability of a people who had only recently been freed. Faced with this aggression, Moses instructed Joshua to select men and lead the battle against the Amalekites. This was the first military battle for the people of Israel since their exodus from Egypt. While Joshua fought in the valley, Moses ascended a hill accompanied by Aaron and Hur. Moses held the staff of God in his hand. The narrative then describes a highly symbolic scene. When Moses keeps his hands raised, Israel gains the upper hand in the battle, but when his arms grow weary and lower, Amalek begins to gain ground. Seeing this, Aaron and Hur support his arms so that they remain raised until sunset. Through this combined action, the battle in the valley and the intercession on the hill, Israel ultimately achieves victory. After this victory, Moses builds an altar and gives it a special name, Yahweh Nissi, which means, "The Lord is my banner." By this act, Moses acknowledges that victory comes not only from the strength of the warriors, but also from God's intervention and support. It is in this context that he makes the solemn declaration that Amalek has raised his hand against the throne of the Lord. This expression signifies that, by their attack on Israel, the people God had just delivered, the Amalekites have, in effect, opposed God's own authority and plan. The declaration also announces that this opposition will not be limited to this event. It affirms that there will be a war of the Lord against Amalek from generation to generation. The declaration made by Moses in the book of Exodus, "Because a hand was lifted up against the throne of the Lord, there will be war of the Lord against Amalek from generation to generation," did not remain a mere statement made after a battle in the desert. In biblical history, this assertion will be progressively confirmed throughout the generations of the people of Israel. It becomes a kind of guiding thread that runs through several periods of Israel's history and shows how the hostility between Israel and Amalek will reappear at different times. After the first battle at Rephidim, the people of Israel continued their journey through the desert toward the Promised Land, the region of Canaan. Several years later, as the generation that had come out of Egypt approached this land, the memory of the Amalekite attack remained etched in the collective consciousness of Israel. This is why, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses explicitly reminds the people of this event. He asks them to remember how Amalek had attacked them from behind, striking the weakest and most weary. This injunction shows that the event was not considered a mere military incident, but a serious act of hostility against a people under God's protection. Later, as the people of Israel gradually settled in the Promised Land after the conquest led by Joshua, the Amalekites continued to appear in biblical narratives as persistent enemies. During the period of the Judges, an era marked by repeated cycles of unfaithfulness, oppression, and deliverance, Amalek sometimes allied itself with other peoples to attack Israel. For example, in the book of Judges, the Amalekites joined forces with neighboring peoples to invade Israelite territory and ravage the crops. These attacks caused great suffering for the Israelites and illustrated the continuation of the hostility foretold in Moses' declaration. The most explicit fulfillment of this prophecy, however, appeared several centuries later, during the Israelite monarchy. When Saul became the first king of Israel, God gave him a specific mission recorded in the book of 1 Samuel. Through the prophet Samuel, Saul was commanded to fight Amalek in remembrance of what this people had done to Israel when they came out of Egypt. This command clearly shows that the initial Amalekite attack had not been forgotten and continued to have repercussions in Israel's history. However, the narrative also shows that King Saul did not fully comply with the instructions he received. He spared the Amalekite king and kept some of the plunder. This disobedience would have significant consequences for his reign, as it is presented as one of the reasons why God rejected Saul as king. Thus, even in this attempt to carry out judgment against Amalek, the words spoken generations earlier continued to influence the political and spiritual history of Israel. Later still, in the time of King David, the Amalekites again appeared as adversaries of the people of Israel. In several accounts in the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, David had to confront Amalekite groups who attacked Israelite cities and plundered their possessions. In one of these episodes, the Amalekites destroy the city of Ziklag and take the families of David's men captive. David then pursues the attackers and manages to recover the captives and the taken possessions. This event illustrates once again the continuity of the opposition between Amalek and Israel. The trace of this hostility appears even later in biblical history. In the book of Esther, one of the main adversaries of the Jewish people in this narrative is Haman, who is presented as an Agagite. This term refers to Agag, an Amalekite king mentioned in the accounts concerning King Saul. Many interpreters see in this detail an allusion to the ancient rivalry between Amalek and Israel, suggesting that this opposition symbolically continues even several centuries later. Thus, when we look at the entire biblical narrative, we find that the declaration made after the Battle of Rephidim resonates with several moments in the history of Israel. The Amalekites appear regularly as adversaries of God's people, from the desert period to the monarchical era, and even in some later narratives. This continuity is interpreted in the Bible as the progressive fulfillment of Moses' words, an enduring opposition between Amalek and the people of Israel. From a historical and theological perspective, this succession of events shows how an initial act of hostility can profoundly shape the relationship between two peoples. In the biblical view, Amalek's attack on a vulnerable people emerging from slavery was not merely a military act, but an opposition to God's work. This is why this confrontation is described as a struggle that transcends the simple framework of human warfare and is inscribed within the spiritual history of the people of Israel. The declaration spoken by Moses in the book of Exodus, "Because a hand was lifted up against the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation," first found its fulfillment in the ancient biblical history of Israel. But for many believers and biblical interpreters, this statement also possesses a spiritual dimension that transcends antiquity. In this reading, Amalek becomes the symbol of a recurring spirit of opposition against the existence and destiny of Israel. After nearly 2 millennia of the Jewish people's dispersion throughout the world, a major historical event occurred in the 20th century. Following the tragedies of World War II and the genocide of the Holocaust, the international community supported the creation of a Jewish state in the Middle East. In 1948, the State of Israel was officially proclaimed. However, no sooner had the state been established than it faced war. Several Arab nations immediately attacked the new state in what history calls the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. For some religious interpreters, this immediate hostility symbolically recalls the Amalekite attack in the desert, when the Israelites had just left Egypt and were in a position of great vulnerability. Over the decades, Israel has continued to face several major conflicts, including the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. These conflicts have reinforced, for some believers, the idea that hostility toward Israel is not only political or territorial, but also has a deeper spiritual dimension. In some prophetic readings of the Bible, Several commentators associate modern-day Iran with the ancient Persia mentioned in Scripture. In biblical history, Persia sometimes plays a favorable role toward the Jewish people. For example, when King Cyrus the Great allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem after the exile. However, in some contemporary interpretations, Persia is also seen as a significant player in prophecies concerning the nations of the Middle East. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, relations between Iran and the State of Israel have been extremely strained. Iran considers Israel a major strategic adversary, while Israel views Iran's nuclear program and regional influence as a threat to its security. In recent years, this tension has escalated into direct confrontation. In April 2024, Iran launched a massive attack against Israel using drones and ballistic missiles in what was one of the first direct attacks between the two countries. This operation involved hundreds of projectiles launched from Iran and its regional allies. A few months later, in October 2024, another Iranian attack involved approximately 200 missiles, targeting, among other things, Israeli military bases. The confrontation escalated further in 2025 when Israeli strikes targeted military and nuclear facilities in Iran. In response, Iran launched over 150 ballistic missiles and more than 100 drones at Israel in a direct retaliation. These military exchanges marked a major turning point. For the first time, the shadow of indirect warfare between the two nations erupted into direct confrontations. Tensions continued to rise, with missile strikes, drone attacks, and military operations targeting strategic infrastructure and military bases. Hundreds of projectiles were launched, and several facilities were hit, while Israeli defense systems intercepted a large portion of the attacks. From a theological perspective adopted by some biblical scholars, these contemporary confrontations are sometimes interpreted as the modern expression of what the Bible calls the opposition of Amalek. In this view, Amalek represents not only a vanished ancient people, but also a recurring principle of hostility toward Israel. According to this interpretation, the spirit of Amalek manifests itself whenever a power or ideology seeks to destroy Israel or deny its right to exist. Thus, modern conflicts, military threats, or certain forms of political hostility are sometimes perceived as a symbolic continuation of this opposition described in Scripture. It is important, however, to distinguish between the spiritual interpretation of events and historical analysis. Modern conflicts in the Middle East result from numerous complex factors: geopolitical rivalries, territorial issues, and religious and strategic stakes. Nevertheless, for those who read history in light of biblical texts, the succession of conflicts involving Israel, from its rebirth in 1948 to the current tensions with Iran, can be understood as a contemporary illustration of the prophecy spoken in the desert, an opposition that transcends generations. From this spiritual perspective, Moses' declaration in the desert is not merely a memory of the past, but a prophecy that continues to invite believers to reflect on the profound dynamics of history, where human conflicts can sometimes be seen as a reflection of a broader spiritual struggle concerning the destiny of the people of Israel. At the end of this wonderful moment, the question may arise: is the word spoken by Moses in biblical times being fulfilled before our very eyes? Will it continue to be fulfilled until the end of time, as the Scriptures mention? No one knows except God alone, but one thing remains certain: God Himself watches over His word to ensure its fulfillment. If this moment has been beneficial for your edification, please like the video, share it, and leave a comment about this passage and current events. Don't forget to subscribe to continue following our moments of reflection.